Hello, I'm Kerry Timchuk, Executive Director of the Oregon Historical Society. 3 weeks after the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, when the world was afraid to get on an airplane, much less a plane to New York City, 1 in every 3,000 Oregonians, 1,000 in all, took 62 flights to New York City in an organized effort to boost the tanking New York economy. Led by then Portland Mayor, the one and only Vera Katz, the Flight for Freedom included individuals from a wide range of backgrounds, political persuasions, and cultures, unified in supporting their fellow Americans. In observance of the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Sally Bourrie is here with us today to share a talk on her new book, Oregon Loves New York, which documents this historic effort. Featuring interviews with more than 75 participants, stories of nearly 300 Freedom Fliers, and 200 photos from the trip, Oregon Loves New York is an inspiring story of Americans and Oregonians at their best, showing up for their fellow Americans in a time of tragedy. Sally, we're honored to have you with us today as we talk about the 20th anniversary and about this new, really inspiring book of yours, Oregon Loves New York. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Kerry. It is my pleasure to get to tell this story, and I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to let people know about it.
And the first question, Sally, everyone remembers, where were you on 9/11 when it happened?
Well, this is a pretty funny story, actually. I lived in Portland, and I was a freelance writer. And I had actually hit a lull in some of the stories that I'd finished the stories that I had pitched, and I was ready to go on to something the next thing. And so I thought, I'm going to go out on my front porch and go through the newspapers this morning and find things going on in Oregon that I could pitch to. I wrote for other newspapers around the country. So I actually am one of the few people that missed that moment of 9/11. And of all the mornings to decide to catch up on the news, that was not the morning to do it. So I found out later when people said to me, what I think is what many people heard that morning, which is turn on your television.
Right.
I heard that much later. Yeah.
So you were in Portland then when this idea first came up, and there are so many heroes that led to this, and you talk about them in your book. Joe DiZono, of course, great Oregon businessman, being the lead advocate. It's just a fascinating, inspiring story. What led you to your interest in this effort, and what led to the book?
Well, at the time, as I said, I was living in Portland, and just like everybody else, I did not know Joe DiZono or any of the people that organized this, but I was like a lot of people, and I heard about it on TV. They announced it on September 26th, which was just barely 2 weeks after the September 11th attacks. And I thought, oh my gosh, I want to be part of this. And so just like everybody else, back then, especially young people don't realize that you didn't just go on the web and click in and say, reserve a spot for me. So you had to call Azamana Travel. You could email them and try to get a spot on the trip. And one thing that I really want to emphasize to people is that Azamana Travel did not make any money on this trip. This was purely a philanthropic effort. And all the organizers that worked on this did this as volunteers. So at Azamana, when like 3,000 people clicked on the website, and they got hundreds of calls within hours of announcing this trip. They had volunteers down there. They had some of the people that worked there just answering the phones and writing down, so-and-so wants to go on this trip, so-and-so wants to go on this trip. And then you had to wait. And they had hoped that maybe 150 people would be interested in going. And after a few days, they had to cap it off at 1,000. And that says, I think, first of all, the organizers, Azamana had very good relationships with the hotels and the airlines. So they could call them, and the airlines were empty because people were afraid to fly. Hotels were empty because people were not going anywhere. But they were able to call and say, look, what kind of deals could you give us now? Because we want to help, and we want to make it possible for as many people who want to help to go. And so they were able to get these unbelievable fares of $379 for a round trip airfare and 2 nights at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the crown jewel of the Hiltons in New York. And so anyway, for me, I found out that I could go, and as a freelance writer, and which means you usually don't make a whole lot of money, I thought, how am I going to pay for this trip? And so I got assignments from the Chicago Tribune and the Boston Globe to cover the trip. And then I also wrote a tourism story for the Oregonian. And that's how I financed my trip. So that's how I got involved in the trip. But then the book really results from having been on the trip. Every person that went, I think, feels this way. It was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. The people that went, I say, are a self-selected group of people. Now, you had to have a certain amount of money to be able to pay for this trip. You had to have a certain amount of time to be able to go on the trip. But these were also people that really wanted to help. You know, you could donate money. You couldn't really donate blood. They had thought there would be all these people that would be injured, and then everybody gave blood and they didn't need it because there weren't injured people and there weren't many survivors. So people still wanted to help. What could they do? Well, they could do this trip. And so there was an enormous amount of compassion and heart, I think, among the Oregonians who went on this. And then when they got to New York, you know, we didn't really know what we were going to do. It wasn't like this was some organized group. Nobody, when the trip was announced, it wasn't like, oh, we're all Freedom Fliers and we're all going to get t-shirts and we're going to do all this stuff. It was really people saying, I want to help, I'm going to get on a plane. And that was kind of what most people knew. And when we got there is when most of us, it sort of hit us that we were going to be a group because Azamana Travel had organized us. But we didn't realize, you know, Mayor Giuliani had said, come and spend money. New York is open for business. They were really in a bad state. The economy was in a bad state. But we didn't realize when we got there how empty it would be, how deeply traumatized the people we would find there would be. And I think the part that made me want to do the book is that when we got there, all these Oregonians stepped up and we were confronted with an emotional situation that we had no idea we would be confronted with. Everyone stepped into it. If somebody needed a hug, they got a hug. If somebody needed you to sit there for a half an hour and listen to what they went through on 9/11 or what their niece went through, you did it. And, you know, one of the first things that Nancy Parrott, who was a operations manager at Azamana Travel, did, she mostly lived at the hospitality table in the Waldorf. But the first night when she finally got out at like midnight, she went to a local restaurant. The waiter pulled up a chair to their table and told them his 9/11 story. And everybody went through that and everybody was there for people. And I think when you go through an experience like that and you know you've made a difference, it stays with you. And so for me, that was a big part of it. And so in 2003, I wrote a book for participants in the trip as sort of a memory book for us. But then, you know, as history's gone by, it became clearer to me, first of all, not just what a meaningful experience it was, but nobody else in the country did anything like this. This was 1,000 people who stepped up. And even though many communities contacted Show DeZono and Azamano afterwards about how they could do it too, because it was such a great thing, nobody else did it. It's very little known. It deserves to be known. And especially just coincidentally now, our country's so divided. You know, people got on this trip and nobody cared if you were a Republican or Democrat. Nobody cared what religion you were. You know, the organizers tried to make it as racially and religiously diverse as they could. And it was very, very much, I think it's a very important historical event to document and for the people of America to know about. So that's my
right,
answer.
Those who attended it was such a diverse crowd. You had leaders like Mayor Katz, but then you had business and philanthropic leaders like Pete and Mary Mark and Roger and Laura Meyer. And then you had Margaret Carter, the first African-American woman to serve in the Oregon legislature. And the guests and the attendees ran the gamut from, I said, normal, ordinary people who just love New York to community leaders. And I love the subtitle of the book, A Story of American Unity. And that's truly what it was.
No, that's exactly right. And I mean, you have people too, like when I wrote the 2003 book, which I'm so glad I did, because many of the historical of the documents from that time are now gone, believe it or not, even only in 20 years. But at that time, I had asked people to get in touch with me with their stories. A woman named Deborah Diane Jennis from Crescent Lake, Oregon, which is population 400, and at the time didn't have broadband internet, and found out about the 9/11 attack from the local grocery store. She and her family said, we've got to go. And they had a son. They took him out of school. They said he's going to learn more if he goes on this trip than if I keep him in school. And they got there, and they when they got to the airport, and here's another thing, the people that I spoke with about this were honest. People are candid. And that's also one of the wonderful things, that we can all be who we are and be accepted, and there's no judgment. And, she got there and they had never been to New York. And so they asked at the information desk at LaGuardia, how do we get to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel? And they got the explanation and of all the different ways. And the best way was to take a cab because the cab drivers really needed the help. Well, they got out there, and there's a guy there. The guy who came up in the line for them was wearing a turban. And her husband said to her, oh my gosh, is Osama bin Laden going to drive us to the Waldorf? And she said, get in the cab. And they got in the cab, and they had the most wonderful ride. And he helped them with their luggage, and they hugged him. And it was a wonderful experience. And that's exactly the kind of thing that I think I give her a lot of credit for telling that story. And that's the kind of thing that happened in New York. And I think it's the kind of thing that we need to remember can happen again, and we need to do.
In reading in the book, it seemed like most memorable and inspiring experiences for the participants was marching in was it the Columbus Day Parade in New York City? And I assume you were there in that parade as well. So
no, just like I missed 9/11, I missed the parade. No, I was doing my Oregonian tourism story. So I was down in Tribeca talking to other people. And that is one of the great regrets of my life, because that parade apparently was just incredible. And it's another example of the courage of the people from Oregon on this trip, because the parade took place on Monday, and on Sunday we had started bombing Afghanistan. So there was already fear in New York City about additional terrorist attacks. And anytime a group got together, that there was realistic danger that they could be a target for another attack. And there had been talk about canceling the parade. Many groups dropped out of the parade because they were afraid to be in it. And yet the people from Oregon said, no, we're going to be there. And it became, that year, it was, the subject of it was broadened to like, a celebration of America as well. So there was a lot of red, white, and blue and stuff. But about 500 Oregonians marched in that parade, and 201, they say that it was one of the most inspiring, incredible experiences they've ever had. And it was literally like the people from New York on the sidelines were just throwing love at them. It's, I mean, it must be like when, you know, big rock stars or something up on a stage with that kind of audience. And Show DeZono, who was at the time the head of the Portland Chamber of Commerce, as well as owning Azamana Travel, told all the Freedom Flyers, because everybody had a T-shirt that was white that said "Oregon loves New York," which is why people knew that they could come up to him and hug him and stuff. But they all wore their T-shirts, and he said, "But you can give away your T-shirt to a New Yorker." And and as his daughter Kristen told me, you know, he would just say stuff like this, and it wasn't like they had a budget for anything. You know, he would just say it, and then he's like, "We'll figure out how we're going to pay for it later." So people were able to take off their shirts and give them to New Yorkers. And I actually, in the book, I tracked down a woman who was from New Jersey at the time and had appeared in an Oregonian story thanking the Oregonians for coming. And I found her. She's moved now down to Florida. She was a teacher, and she saw the towers fall. But she still has on her refrigerator a picture of her with her American flag and the red, white, and blue earmuffs she knitted for herself to go to the parade. And none of her friends from New Jersey would come with her because they were too afraid to go. But she got one of our T-shirts, and she still has it. And a picture of her wearing her T-shirt is in the book. So the fact, the people from Oregon need to know that this really did have an effect on the lives of the people in New York. And I'll just tell you one other story. Todd Davidson, who is the head of Travel Oregon and has been the head of Travel Oregon for many, many years and given his life really to travel and the relationships and connections that can happen from it. He went on the trip, and during the parade, there was, he said, a little old lady, a tiny little old lady who was thanking people for all the Oregonians for coming, because to say that they marched in the parade is a real, you know, overstatement. One lady said it was more like a ramble, and they just kind of meandered back and forth to all the people that were on the sidelines wanting hugs and wanting to talk. And so there was a little old lady, and she was thanking people with a two-handed thank you. And by the time Todd came up, she just threw her arms around him and she just thanked him for coming. And they both stood there and cried, and he held her. And I asked him, how long did you hold her? And I'm thinking he'd say, like, you know, a couple minutes, 20 minutes. He stood there with her for 20 minutes. And that's what Oregonians need to know. You can be so proud of the people from Oregon for doing this. And Todd said he tells his story a lot about what travel can do for people. And that's why one of the quotes I have on the back of the book is about the power of human to human contact. And we've kind of missed that with COVID. And I'm hoping we can figure out, even with this talk, maybe virtually, I hope people watching can kind of feel that, because it's really so important. And every person on this trip, I'm sure, touched many, many lives.
What was it like for you to go back and, you know, and interview these folks, you know, some 20 years later? Were they excited to share their memories and to look back at it? And...
You know, I don't think there was one person I spoke with who by the end of it didn't choke up from their memories of the trip. Everybody, I mean, this book, part of the reason this book is 700 pages long with 200 photographs is because people had a lot to say, people had a lot to share. I got so many photographs from people. And yeah, I mean, everybody was excited about it. And there are stories from, I mean, these kind of stories that I'm telling you now, and then there are a couple absolute, I mean, there are some hilarious stories, like one of my favorites, which I had mentioned to you, Carrie, is little things like this was the time when the TSA was born. You know, before this, you could go up to the gate at the airport. You didn't have all these security checks and stuff. Well, when people went out in Portland, it was higher security, but then leaving New York, of course, being New York, and then after the bombings in Afghanistan, the security was even higher. And a woman had brought one of those, she bought her kids one of those little turtles that you used to be able to buy in like Woolworths or somewhere, and you get like a plastic holder with a fake palm tree in it, the little baby turtle.
So a live turtle.
And so, yeah, exactly. And so she had the turtle, and she was like, I should be able to, she expected she'd just like hold on to the turtle and go on the plane. Well, of course, it's security, and they wouldn't let her do it. So they had to find a little plastic box, and the turtle ran through the security, had to go through the security belt. And then another very funny story that I really love is Barbara Shaw, who is one of the great, many of her pictures are in there. She got approval. She found out from Azamana that she was going to get to go on this trip. And like many people, she brought things with her. She actually made a quilt that represented Oregon and New York and brought that with her. But she had been born in New York, and her parents were from New York. And so she made sure to get real cannolis to bring home. And then when she was at the airport, she forgot her camera at the airport, and she got home with her kids, and she said, oh, I lost my camera. And her kids are like, oh, Mom, you can get another camera. The cannolis are great. So there are a lot of stories like that. And I brought some pictures, and I'll tell you the story of the woman who fell in love with her Circle Line tour operator and got married and is now living in New Jersey with him.
Really?
Yes, a woman from Portland.
Oh my gosh.
Yep. So, I mean, it was an amazing thing. And the people that I spoke with, 20 years later they may not have as many memories, but the feeling of the importance of this and how much it touched them in a very, very deep way was as fresh as 20 years ago.
I did love this. I mean, this was truly life-changing, especially for that woman who met her husband on the trip. So,
well, that's right. That's right. It's very funny. And when we see the picture, I'll tell you the punchline. There's even a better punchline of the story. It's very funny.
Well, that's great. What's the message you want people to take from the book?
I think I want people to know that everybody can make a difference. Everybody can. And I want people to know that we can come together and we can find common ground. There are people who went on this trip that I absolutely do not believe in their politics in any way, shape, or form, but we love each other and we communicate, and that bond is there. And I think that we need to at least try. I think we all long for connection again. I think we all long for that time when we were united. And I think we can be that way again. So that's really what I want.
It's a great message
to be.
What's the one, if you had to put your finger on one enduring memory of yours from that trip, what was the image, the memory?
Well, I'll tell you, as you read the book, you will find out that there were a lot of bizarre synchronicities, things where something was just meant to be. It's very weird. And the one for me that was the most powerful was, I went to college in New York. I went to Vassar. And so I had a lot of friends in New York, and many that I had not been in touch with for years and years and years and years. But when this happened, I just reached out to every person that I thought could have been, affected by this. to make sure they were okay. Well, lo and behold, a woman that I had not been in touch with really since graduation lived in Battery Park City, which was right across from the World Trade Center. And she was one of the people that had to be evacuated, and she was hurt. And it was a deeply, deeply traumatic experience for her. She was homeless. But guess where she was living? The Waldorf Astoria Hotel. I mean, it was unbelievable that, and it turned out, I learned when I interviewed her for the book this time that all the hotel rooms were the same price for homeless people. And the Waldorf was near where she worked, and somebody from her temple was able to get her a room in the Waldorf, and so that's why she was there. But I couldn't believe it when I talked to her that she was in the Waldorf. And so we reconnected after, I'm not going to tell you how many years, and she came down to the lobby. Her name's Lisa Sokoloff, and her story's in the book. I have a section of the book that I called Where They Were, Geography and Emotions. And the geography part is for people who aren't from Oregon to understand how diverse Oregon is geographically. It's not just like rainy Portland with ultra liberal hipster people. And for people to understand kind of what the emotional situation was that the Oregons landed in from Lisa's story. So her interview is in there. But when we got to the Waldorf, I called her and she came down to the lobby and told people her story. And I put it in my Boston Globe article. And one of the Oregonians said, that's what we came here for. And what I did not understand until I talked to Lisa for the book was that she said at that time, the stories, the grief, the attention was all about the people that had been on the planes and the first responders. And there wasn't the attention on the people in the city of New York. And I had not even thought about that. And so she said, to be able to tell these stories to the people from Oregon, she said, I'll never forget that. It's like they were my witnesses. You know, they were witnesses. And I didn't understand how probably for people in New York, maybe they felt guilty about talking about how upset they were, because certainly they were still alive, you know, and everybody around them had that same burden of having been through this. So here come these people from Oregon who are more or less, you know, bright, chipper, you know, ready to help. And I think there was a vacuum that we filled that I hadn't even realized was there. So for me, that was the most enduring memory of the trip.
And as karma would have it, as I recall, this trip was like 60 or 61 years to the date after then Portland Mayor Vera Katz had arrived in New York City as she and her family escaped Hitler's Germany. And what a tremendously emotional experience it was for Mayor Katz to be there at that time, you know, on that anniversary.
That's right. And it was quite an emotional journey that she had to take to decide to go on the trip, because of that very reason, that New York was her safe haven. That's where they landed. And then it got bombed and it wasn't safe anymore. And it also, apparently she was very afraid to fly. So she hadn't even been back to where she lived for all those years. But she said, and so that's just an example too of courage. And she and Nick Fisher, who I dedicated the book to, and she really had to be courageous within herself to do this. And she said, you know, I kind of walked through all this and I realized, well, that's a little bit selfish. That's what she told me. That's a little bit selfish not to go. This is my city and they organized this. And she gave her full heart and soul. And the whole time she was there, she was working. She was on radio. She was on TV. She was in the parade. And one of the pictures that I included in her is her laughing with a guy from Portland who worked on, it was called something like a jobber for gas stations. They got their picture taken together and they're both just laughing like crazy and having a great time. And I mean, she was so present. And her communications person, Sarah Bott, spoke with me and told me that this was, she had gotten death threats. And she went anyway. And she had a bodyguard from Portland. And then she also had off-duty New York cops that followed her around all the time. So it was not, this was no joke that she was being courageous to go on this trip.
And for those who might not know, you mentioned Nick Fish, and Nick was a Portland civic leader, a city councilman who passed away much too soon, and was a New Yorker from a very long-standing New York family. Sally, you mentioned some photos. Do we want to share some photos real quick with our audience?
I would love that. Yes, thank you.
Right.
Let's do. And I'll tell you what they are.
Okay. So Sally, this is a great image. Tell us about this photo.
Yeah, this is Margaret Carter on the plane.
A former board member of the Oregon Historical Society, by the way, a wonderful friend.
And she went on the trip because she had served in the Oregon House with Mayor Katz and Darlene Hooley, who at the time was a congresswoman from Oregon. And so Mayor Katz called her and said, Carter, we're going to go on this trip together. You got to go. And so she went, and she was a state senator at the time. And she was one of the leaders of the trip. And actually she and former Governor Vic Atiyah, who was Arab American, were the diversity committee and were among the people that worked on making sure that it was racially diverse.
Yeah, that's Margaret. She's a great Oregonian, great lady. This picture, this fellow looks like Gilligan.
This is one of the funniest things that I have ever seen. Yes, he is holding himself parallel to the ground. And that white hat is, and the red shirt should remind you of a certain generation of Gilligan. There was a woman from Portland who went on the trip. She went all by herself. And the last day she heard that the Mercy Corps was going to be making some care packages for kids in New York. So she decided that she would stay an extra day and do that. And her niece said to her, you ought to take a tour of New York while you're there. So she went down to the Circle Line, which is a boat. There's a few boats, and they go around the island of Manhattan and give a tour. So she went on the boat, and this guy, gave the tour, and he couldn't do his famous Gilligan that day because he had actually been taken off the ship in an emergency appendectomy a couple days before 9/11. And this was his first day back, but it was the first time that the boats were actually going. And the guy who was supposed to lead the tour called him up and said, you know what, I just can't do it today. Would you mind doing it? So he did. And he told him all about the Gilligan, and he did his pose, and people crowded around, and he had to say, please don't crowd around. And they did it anyway. And he and Leslie shared a look when everyone else was crowding around. And both of them remember that. And he did a great tour. And afterwards, she was at the airport waiting around. She thought, I'm going to call the Circle Line and tell them that I really thought this guy did a good job. And so a couple months later, he finally got the message, and he thought, oh my gosh. And he remembered that she was from Portland, and he called the directory assistants in the state of Oregon and said, give me everybody whose name is Leslie, whatever. And he got it, and he just started calling, and he got her, and they spoke to each other for hours, and they just connected. And over the course of the next year, she flew back there, he flew out to Portland, and they ended up getting married. And he had a master's degree in acting. And so being on the Circle Line was a much better way for him to be employed than to try to do office work. He said, his name's David Parker. He said, I'm a non-traditional personality. And so she moved out there. They've been married now all this time, and they have children. And the picture of them together on the boat with the water is their wedding picture. And the real punchline to all this was when she got back and she told her niece about taking the tour, she said, I meant for you to take a bus tour. So that was one of the great stories. I think also you have that picture of the stock exchange too, where everybody
there it is. Yep.
Went there to ring the bell at the stock exchange. That was an extremely prestigious opportunity. Now, again, that happened the day after we started bombing Afghanistan. And it was right downtown where the World Trade Center had been. So high security was even higher on that day. And I'm not going to tell everybody the story, but people need to read the book to see the extraordinary story Jack McGowan tells about he had worked at the stock exchange 33 years before, and the amazing reunion that he had when he went back to work that day. But you'll see from left to right, there's show of at the far left, and just to his right is Jack McGowan, and just to his right is Dick Grasso from the New York Stock Exchange. And I'm pardon me for looking off camera, but I wanted to make sure I could tell you to the audience who everybody is. Then Darlene Hooley, you can see her there in the center. She was on the finance committee in Congress, and she's the one who made it possible. They bumped the Speaker of the House that day to let the Oregonians do this. And then right next to her is Oregon State Treasurer Randall Edwards. His wife, who's a school board member, Julia Brim Edwards. And in the book, there are lovely stories about them going to school classrooms, and they brought things from the kids in Oregon and explained to the kids about Oregon. Really touching. These were kids that actually were right there when very close by when the towers came down. And then you'll also see the Portland Chamber of Commerce. In the back row is Dan McClave, Cheryl Perrin, who's from the Port of Portland, Commissioner Roger Hinshaw, Bank of America president at the time for our region, or Pacific Northwest. So you've really got many high-level people from Oregon who went to New York and did that.
Including people from, again, it's important to mention that it wasn't just Portlanders. It was people from around the state, as you said. The mayor of Hermiston, I know, went, and from all over Oregon.
That's right. And actually, the mayor of Hermiston, which is in the northwest corner of Oregon, and at the time was known as the watermelon capital of the world. Mm-hmm. And his wife wore a watermelon on her lapel, and she actually had a few extra pins and gave one to one of the flight attendants on the airplane. And there's a lovely story about how after that, that meant so much to one of those flight attendants that one of her friends who'd lost many people in the towers contacted her, Beverly Harkenrider, and they became friends. And this woman from New York came out and visited her. So I mean, this was something where people really need to understand what it meant to New Yorkers that Oregonians did this. And on that note, we'll just show that picture of Nancy McCauber, who's standing in front of the American flag with her American flag and her earmuff she made to go to the parade. And, she's kept this after many moves to remind her that she went on this, she had the courage to go to the parade. And then you see a picture that she took with her cell phone wearing her t-shirt. 20 years later, she's still got her Oregon Loves New York t-shirt that somebody gave her on the parade.
Well, Sally, I see the book behind you there on your bookshelf, nicely displayed, and of course there it is. And we have it at the Oregon Historical Society in our gift shop. And where else can we'll have information on our website as well where they can find the book.
Yeah, I mean the easiest thing to tell you right now is go to the Oregon Loves New York website, and you can click on Order Here and order a book.
Well, thank you very much for being with us and to help us commemorate. You know, when you talk about the 20th anniversary of 9/11, you think about all the, you know, the awful things that happened on that day. But this also reminds us of the inspiring things that happened on the day, of people coming together, of a nation uniting. And as you said, boy, that it's a message we need right now.
That's right. Well, I sure appreciate you getting the word out about this and celebrating all the people of Oregon who did such a great thing.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.